All right, today we'll talk about NDBs, which are non-directional beacons, and ADF, which is the equipment in the airplane used to track those beacons. NDBs, as we said, are non-directional beacons, meaning it's a radio beacon that broadcasts outward in all directions. It just sends out radio waves. An ADF is an automatic direction finder. And what it does is it homes in on where that radio wave is coming from. And we'll go into that in a little more detail after we discuss the beacons themselves. They're very simple. It's just a ground-based radio transmitter. If you look at the first image here, first set of images here, you can see it's usually just an antenna mounted on a pole. Because it's in a stationary location, though, you know where the antenna is at. So it gives you a reference when you're flying and says, hey, I know where that spot is. How can I get there? It's a lot different than the navigation that we use today that tells us, hey, here's where you are, here's how to get there. This was simply a way of saying, hey, I know where someplace is. Point me that direction, basically. Help me try to fly there. And that gets complicated, and we'll discuss why. Here in North America, they are within a specific range, and that range is pretty much the AM radio range. Back in the day, a lot of times these non-directional beacons, that's what they were, is they were just an AM radio beacon. And you could tune in and listen to the AM radio over your ADF. We limit those radio frequencies, which usually it's only between 190 to 525 kilohertz, because then it actually goes into that old school AM radio band. And AM radio waves can bounce off of the atmosphere. And when that happens, what you'll run into is, picking up an AM radio station, say here at Springfield, that's actually on the West Coast. You would be, flying to a radio source that's in reality somewhere bouncing off of the sky, not realistically taking you to where the location of the antenna is. The way that this works, without going too in depth and discussing the ADF, is you are told where that NDB is located. So hey, I know that antenna is in a spot, but you as a pilot are going to have to determine how to get there. You're going to have to calculate your wind. You're going to have to compensate for any maneuvers. You don't have any sort of idea where you're actually positioned in relation to it. You just know where it is and how to try to fly to it. And I've got a way that we can kind of visualize that a little bit later that'll help understand that. The main difference is it doesn't calculate any sort of course. It just tells you a blind heading. And as you move around on the chart, yes, the heading changes, but it doesn't tell you how that relates to you other than, hey, turn a different direction. So you could potentially point towards an NDB, and as you have to maneuver and you fly somewhere, go around a mountain, now you're pointing back towards the source, but you're in a different location and you don't know where that is in relation to what you're doing. So if you're flying VFR, that might be okay. If you didn't have any reference, say at night or in the clouds or something like that, it'd be really hard to figure out, you made a maneuver, now where did you end up? So it doesn't help you navigate anywhere but to the NDB itself. So the other thing about it is it's kind of like a VOR. As you get closer to it, since it's broadcasting in all directions, it gets really sensitive and the needle can waver a lot the closer you get to it, because small adjustments will now put you in a drastically different location as you get closer to the beacon itself. So let's talk about the ADF, which is the equipment that's in the plane that tracks it. That's the automatic direction finder. And so if you have this radio beacon out there and you are, trying to get to that beacon, the ADF just takes a gauge in the aircraft and tunes to that radio frequency and points a needle towards it. Older ADF wouldn't tell you where to fly. You would actually have to physically turn the aircraft in order to figure out what that heading was, unless you did the math, on the gauge saying, hey, it's this many degrees off. Now I take my heading and I take that many degrees that direction, and you would have to calculate that on the fly, or you would actually have to turn the plane to figure out where it was. We'll see why that is a little bit weird too. I have a simulator that'll kind of show us how that works. The interesting part about ADF is the way that it tracks the radio signal, and that's because there's two antennas. One is like the NDB. It receives radio frequencies in all directions. And you can see that in the picture that's included here. It's the small red, it's really the big green circle. And so it receives radio from everywhere, and it says, hey, the radio is somewhere in that direction. Then what you have is a loop antenna, and these are like a round circle. If you think of really old planes, you used to see the big, huge circle hoop on like a post, and sometimes they would even turn, and that's because they would spin, because as the hoop would spin flat, it would pick up the radio broadcast a lot stronger. So you had a 180-degree eliminator. It would say, hey, the radio frequency is that direction, not that direction. Combining those two readings, you can tell where the signal is not at, and then a 90-degree angle from there puts you in the direction that the actual radio frequency is coming from. Older ADFs, they had the movable needle, but they didn't do anything except for tune the antenna. Some of them you had to manually tune the antenna to find the direction. It would make the needle point, but the gauge itself wouldn't do anything. Later models, they did make it to where it was a movable card, kind of like what we're used to with VOR, equipment, where you could move the card and find out what heading you needed to fly. But for the most part, old school NDB ADF navigation was just all kind of done on the fly in your head. So as we watch this video that I'm going to splice in here, you'll kind of get to see what I am talking about with this ADF navigation. So you start with a plane. It's down there in the right-hand corner. And what we've got is we've got three different NDBs, and you would fly, you would tune to a beacon, which we're using the one in the top left corner there, the one that's 249 for the frequency. You would tune to it and point your plane at it. And then to measure where you were, you would tune to another NDB and determine when you got at a 90-degree angle. So we've tuned to that first one that we passed. Now we've tuned to the second one, and we're watching and switching back and forth, waiting for that 90-degree angle. When there's no wind, this is pretty easy. You point the plane to where the needle points north, so you know the plane is pointed directly at the NDB you want to go to. And then you can gauge your direction by switching back and forth to other NDBs. Since they're all in known locations, now you kind of have a reference for where you're flying and where you're at on your course. The fun part is when we put wind in with this, and you start to change up the efficiency, basically, of how you fly. So if we reset the plane down there in the right-hand corner, even if we line up with the NDB, so we're going to go ahead and set our course to the NDB. We've got our radio frequencies tuned in, but let's set the wind to 15 knots. And now you can see that our plane is drifting because the wind is affecting us. It's pushing us. So we accelerate forward. We point at the NDB. Now we have to enter in our other frequency for this first NDB that we're trying to track that we're going past. And hopefully as we switch, we can keep our course set to the original NDB we're going to. Then we watch for 90 degrees. Okay, there we are. Now we've passed that first beacon, so we know where we are. And we think we're flying the same course that we were before when there was no wind, but you can see we're not. In reality, we're making this big sweeping curve because the wind is pushing us off course, and we can't tell where, if you were in the plane, you wouldn't be able to tell where you actually are in relation to these. You're just looking at these instruments going, okay, I'm not past the second NDB yet. I'm still not past the second NDB yet. What the heck? This is taking way longer. Why is it showing so much off? And it's because you don't have a way to constantly reference where the plane actually is. So you could imagine how this would be pretty difficult. You can see we're still not even 90 degrees from it, and we're way off course. If we were trying to line up for a runway or something like that, it would be pretty hard to figure out where you are. There's a lot of bearing math that you would have to be doing on the fly to try and figure out how to get to the correct position at this NDB that we're flying towards. So NDBs aren't exactly the best way of navigating if you don't have the ability to see where you're going and what you're doing and have some sort of reference for where the plane is at. So here's the other weird thing about NDBs is there are a lot of ways that ADF can be interfered with. You would have to calculate your headings and bearings, but if you incorrectly adjust that card on one of the adjustable ones, now everything is off. If you incorrectly do that math on the fly where you're like, oh, it's 25 degrees, the needle's 25 degrees from my heading. If your heading's changed or like you're being blown off course, now your math is off, you're having to readjust it. You can see you'd have to be doing some pretty complicated math to calculate where you're going to intercept the NDBs that are to the side of your course. And if you do that wrong, now you're off course again. If you overcorrect, like you saw how when we were getting close to the NDB, we kept having to swing farther and farther off of our heading to get to point to the NDB. Now you're overcorrecting for that needle movement. If you don't tune the right frequency, or if you pick up a frequency that's, way out on the East Coast that shares the same number, and now you've flown, several hundred miles in the wrong direction until you pick up the correct one. The other weird things are ADF needles point towards a thunderstorm. They point towards a shoreline when you're crossing the shoreline. If the signal bounces off of terrain or other things, they're going to point towards that bounce. It can move due to interference from electrical equipment in the plane. So you flip something on and the needle now points off. Static buildup was also known to affect it. So if you were flying through weather, it could make the needle wander as electrical charges are occurring on the outside of the antennas in the plane. The other thing about it is, just in general, the accuracy has a variance of 5 to 10%. So you can imagine 5 to 10% as you're getting close to an NDB. I mean, that within 40 miles, that could still get you pretty far off course if you're trying to navigate straight to an airport. So overall, ADF NDB, it's way more complicated than anything we're using right now. It's way more prone to error, and it's way more prone to course issues because you don't actually know where you are. So quite frankly, I'm very glad we don't have to use it.